What are we talking about? We talked about the signs last week, right? We finished up the last sign, that we looked at was the raising of Lazarus, which is super interesting, of course, right? It's interesting on so many different levels. It's interesting because it's only in the book of John. It's interesting because it's the last sign. It's interesting because it gives us insight into the divine nature of Jesus. I mean, there's a lot going on. So I guess before we move on, because what I'd like to do today, this is our final Bible study with me for this season. I'm going on sabbatical, I guess you can read a lot of the Bible while I'm gone. I know I'm going to be. It's going to be nice to read it without any reason to read it, except just to read it, because it's a pretty interesting book. So there's always a reason, right, Rachel, to read the Bible. But so I'd like to see if there's any questions on John, or just generally any theological questions, liturgical questions, questions about the Bible, questions that you might have that we can play with today and talk about, because that would be cool. And I'll write them up on the board, and then we'll think about it. You know, I can understand why there might not be any questions, right? Because we've done such a good job over the years at the Rector's Bible study that people are like, no, I get it. Like, I'm totally on board. I don't have any questions about the Bible anymore. I used to. I just come now for the fellowship, right?
I've got a question.
No.
So I've been coming to the Bible study for a couple of years now, and I still haven't read the whole Bible. So would you suggest like sitting down and reading the Bible like a novel? Or I know we've done like different bits and bobs here, but can you read it like a novel? And if so, why? Or if not, why is it not a good idea to read it like a novel? Or should you get that book, The Message, that actually reads like a novel, and it's more like a story of the Bible that's easier to understand? Because even though I've been studying the Bible with you, Dwight, I still don't feel like I've got a grasp. And that's not a reflection on you. It's a reflection on me, I think.
Well, if you stay for a couple more years and study.
I know, but I'm leaving.
I know, you're moving to Chicago. Which is super sad. Although the good news on that is you can join us here.
I know, I can. And
somebody who teaches the Bible a little bit better. So that's a good question. So the first thing to think about with regards to the Bible is it isn't a novel, right? It is not a cohesive story in a linear narrative for the mind of humanity, right? It is a book written about God. And so the problem with a book written about God and our perspective on God in the world is that it's like huge, right? Because you can't actually capture it. I mean, even in the Gospel of John, the end of it, chapter 20, verse 43 or something, John, the author, says that this is just enough so you know that Jesus is the Son of the living God, right? Because you could write everything about what Jesus did, and all of the pages you filled out would cover the globe. Something like that. So what does it say really, Anne?
It says, be that there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself would not contain the books that would be written.
Exactly. So,
wow.
So, right, a lot of stuff that God can do, right? Bigger than the world, and we know that. So the first thing to do when you're reading the Bible is to know you're going to pick a piece that's going to give you some insight. And even within Genesis itself, for example, right, the first 11 books are a very different experience than when you get to chapter 12 and you start reading about the story of Abraham, right? So even within a book, you get different perspectives. So the first thing to remember is that these are a bunch of books written by many different people over a period of time, all through whom are wrestling with the nature of God and their relationship with God. So that's the first thing to think about. So to pick it up, open it up, and just start flipping through it, you can do. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you take the perspective that this wasn't written as a human narrative story, but as a story about humanity's relationship with God. Point number two, if you want to have the best insight into God, you go to the source. And the source is Jesus, right? So the source is the gospel. And so if you say, I'm going to read the Bible, I'm going to spend the summer just reading the Bible. start with the Gospels. Like that's the beginning place to start, even though it's a little bit later in the book. And my suggestion is you start with Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. You've heard me say this, Rachel, right? And because those three are sort of a story, right? Matthew and Luke are built on the story of Mark, right? And they're cohesive in their way, and they have a perspective. Right? John has a unique perspective. We talked a little bit about that last week, and how Peter's written into the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Martha is written into the Gospel of John. That's super cool. So the point is, go there. Now, when you go there, what we're looking for in the Bible is we're looking for big rocks, right? Big rocks through which we can filter. And this is the thing that I want to do a better job with as a teacher. Because if you have a couple of big rocks that you can set on your desk when you're reading the Bible, what you then have is a way in which to look at the stories that you encounter. Now, most of us have been given rocks, big rocks, by secular society. Right, so I'll give you. So we're trained in a narrative linear storyline. That's what we're trained, right? We're trained to look at things very myopically with regards to how the individual experiences the particular thing that happens, right? And so when you read a story like some of these healing stories, where do we go? We go straight to science, right? Or our conception of science, right? That's exactly where we go, because that's what we've been trained to do within our school system. We haven't been trained to think theologically. We've been to think linearly, right? And in a way that reduces things down, right? As opposed to see how all of the relationships fit as a whole. It's not entirely fair to science, but that is a little bit of the way we think. So we say, gosh, this can't happen. You can't put a guy in some water and his legs straighten out, right? If we're looking at it through a particular rock. But if we're looking at healings through the rock of inclusion, then we have a different way of looking at it. And so what we try to do when we read the Bible is we try to collect our rocks through which we look at the stories. And these are rocks, mostly that we learn in the church, and mostly we don't learn in our culture. Okay, so then we have a way of understanding, because otherwise you can read the Bible and like, what? This is crazy. Right? And there's some crazy in the Bible because there's some crazy in life, right? So of course it's going to show up in the Bible. And so I encourage you to read the Gospels, go to the source, think about Jesus. Then we put together our rocks, right? And we look at some of the rocks through which we see this, right? One is, and then you go back and you begin to read maybe through, well, then you read the rest of the New Testament. And the New Testament is ordered how? The book of Acts, and then the letters of Paul, and they're ordered by length, which is weird. But it's random too, right? It's a little bit like life. How are we going to put these things in order? I don't know. Put the longest one first. I've sort of budget. People are weird like that. So those are the things that I would think that I would encourage you when you're reading the Bible. The message misses the point. Fundamentally misses the point. Because what?
You're talking about that book.
Yeah. Interpretation. Yeah. It misses the point because it tries to create a narrative that doesn't exist. Because Richard Foster, I think Foster does that, right? He's the guy, he's trying to do something that it wasn't made to do. So Peterson, Eugene Peterson, sorry. It's nice and it's clever and it's helpful in some regards, and it doesn't do the thing that it was made to do. So a lot. Those you're like, oh my God, I'm moving to Chicago.
I heard you say before that it's best to read Mark and Matthew. Why then why is the Bible ordered Matthew, Mark, and why aren't maybe some interpretations or translations of the Bible don't fit? Mark, Matthew.
I don't know.
It was length. You've said many times, always start with Mark.
Yeah, the only reason I start with Mark is that it's short, it's fast, it's the point, right? It's like this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. And the interesting thing about Mark, you see the word immediately in the Gospel of Mark. I don't know, it's either 27 or 53 times, I have no idea, but there's a lot, it's immediate, like there's a sense of urgency about it. And so it just sort of gets you kicked into the zone, right? And then you get a weird ending at the end of Mark. which is an invitation, some people say, an invitation to circle back and read it again. I mean, I often say to folks, read Mark twice and then read Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke, I just put them together because they're similar and they're different, right? They all have components of Mark. So now, after you've read Mark, you see the components in Matthew and you see the components in Luke. So but I don't know why somebody has an opinion on why the editors put it that
I mean,
way.
it was length, wasn't it? I mean, I think
No, it's not, because Mark's the shortest.
but there was some rationale, and it was kind of it was random. I don't
I'm sure
remember
it
what
was.
it was.
Shelley, do you know
Well,
what?
this is conjecture, but when it was put together by whoever the big authorities were in the church way back when, they didn't have so much all of the, what do you call, biblical scholarship and evidence where they were studying the Bible, what snippets were carried out here and there, and the discovery of Q and all this. So that has informed more what we know. I think.
Yeah, we
But this was all decided way before then.
I mean, you know what's so cool about the Bible is there's two things, right? It is inherently what it is and stands alone and has its own value right now. And in the same way it did 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 1,500 years, right? And you know a lot more about it too, which is also crazy, right? The further away you get from the source, the more you know about it. But it's true.
One other thing, this is my second year of reading the 365-day
So
snippet of going through the Bible, and it is extremely disjointed, but what I find happens for me a little bit, and it's like, wow, it's like you just start to fill in the little pieces around the big rock, as Dorothy might say. So I find that helpful. I mean, I too, like you, might go this summer and do a big deep dive somewhere while I'm also doing that 365-day snippet. And then the other thing that's super interesting to me, and I think I thought you were going to say something about, is the reading and taking in this information within the tempo of the flow of the church life. And I guess I go back to, I still am wrestling with the liturgical calendar and how does that play out in a much more layperson way in our church. Like, do people feel like they're in that flow, or how do you feel like you're in that flow that isn't just about our church, it's about this 3-year cycle?
well, let me try to answer that second question, but I want to say something about the first observation. The other thing about the Bible is you just keep reading it. You just keep reading it, right? Because as you read it, like the discipline of reading it every day, like pretty soon you're like, it becomes different, or you start to see the stories show up in your life in different ways, or you encounter it anew, even though you've read that, the book of Mark 5 times or whatever, right? So I think the discipline, like anything, is the thing that forms, right? So you don't have to understand what's happening when you're running. You just have to not get hit by a car. But if you keep doing it over time, the discipline of that is the formative thing. So that's important. Barbara Karen?
I find for me, it's super helpful to approach the Bible the way I would, reading it the way I would a book of poetry or a book of essays. That there are different takes in different times, and yet there are through lines, and not to look so much for a larger narrative. It's just a form, a familiar form that makes apprehending the Bible, because the Bible is about the apprehension of God and God in our lives. And you can only apprehend it, right? You can't grab it, right? So those are forms, I think if I keep those in mind, it makes it easier, a more accessible read for me.
That's great insight. Good. Other thoughts on the Bible before we jump into this liturgical question?
Well, I would say that the Bible is, it's about relationship, our relationship with God and our relationship with ourselves, and then our relationship with other people. So there is going to be metaphor, there's going to be simile, there's going to be things happening in cultures that we don't quite understand. And I've always thought that it was helpful to me to study in a group with other Episcopalians. It's just much more helpful, whether you do something where you're studying, a group I was in studied the what was coming up with the Bible, with the readings in Sunday church. And we were like reading it on Thursday, and that was helpful. And then you're getting it again on Sunday. BFM is a really helpful way to do it because it's very systematic and you're in a group. It's helpful to have a group, and it's helpful to have a priest. It's really helpful to have somebody who went to seminary.
The liturgical cycle, right? So the idea behind the calendar is that it puts us in a pattern that is not our own, right? So you think about our lives mostly, and they're linear, right? You got this linear screech through life, and so it's all forward, right? But the liturgical calendar, like all religious calendars in other traditions, are circular, right? They're circular, they come around, right? And we come around and we meet an idea in a new place, you know? And they also are, the calendars are organized as a forcing function to cause us to consider particular things. So I've thought about this. So Advent is a time to stop, slow down, listen to what's going on in the world. And so we read Isaiah, right? And Isaiah is the prophet that's saying, hey, we got a problem in the world and we need to take care of it. And John the Baptist is doing the same thing. So we read John the Baptist during Advent. Hey, we got a problem in the world. We are out of, what is the problem? We're out of relationship with God. Because we're out of relationship with God, then we're acting a particular way, right? And so what's the solution to get back into relationship with God in the world? How does that solution play out? Well, God comes into the world, right? So that's it. So then Jesus comes, right? And so in the season of Jesus time, we learn about Jesus. And we consider, how do we act now that we are with God in the world to deal with the problems that we just learned about with Isaiah and John the Baptist. And then the season of Epiphany that comes after that, starting January 6th, then that says, you do it. You are the light of the world, right? That's what Epiphany means, the light, right? And so, but every year we encounter this, like every year we come back, we don't say, oh, we're done with all the problems of the world and now we're going to go on to a new issue. Why? Because we still have problems in the world, right? But we come at it again in a new way. So, and the season of Lent and Easter and the season of ordinary time or the season of Pentecost, whatever you want to call it, does the same thing, but it does it in a bigger branch. It says, what is your relationship with the divine? What is the relationship with the eternal God? So you really look at your soul during Lent, you really think about your eternal relationship with God, and then you act as an eternal being in a temporal space in this bigger time zone, right? And so the calendar cycles us through that over and over again. And the people that put together the liturgical calendar sought to find texts that helped us understand the pattern. And so we make a decision, and it's a countercultural decision, as you know, right? When Christmas comes around, what are you doing? You're planning parties and you're buying gifts and you're doing all that stuff. And that's a hot time, and there's a lot happening, and there's like, and we're also Christians, and we can ask ourselves, what do I want to do that's different, that's countercultural, that allows me to sit back and think differently? So we always know what's coming up. We're never surprised by the liturgical calendar. And then we can plan. Some years I plan it really well, some years I don't plan it at all. But the years I plan it really well, by Thanksgiving, I've bought all my Christmas gifts, I've done all my Christmas cards, honestly, right? Like, so like I can hit Advent and I'm done with Christmas cards. They're all stamped and ready to go. All the gifts are bought, they're done, right? And so I can say to myself, I'm not going to have to, I don't always do this, but I have a number of years, and it feels fabulous going into Advent with that. Now I still go to Christmas parties. I mean, you still do like the other things that come up as being part of the community, but there are things you can do to get ready for the season, right? And step into it and then ask, how am I going to listen to the injustices of the world during Advent? Like who isn't being reached, right? That becomes the spiritual exercise in the season. So, and so the reason we have 3-year cycles, Elizabeth, is because there's enough in it. There's enough in the book, right? To do it 3 times, and you're still skipping some stuff anyway. So that is formative over time, those exercises. Thanks for asking the
Another,
question.
another point of that, Elizabeth, is that we used to just have 1 year, one liturgy. Until like Vatican II, and then they said, even if we're traditional churches, we can read the Bible. There's really been such a response to it. And such an estrangement from people who read the Bible, which still happens sometimes. And so they set up year A, B, and C so that we would have 3 times the Bible that we used to have. So I think that's kind of interesting.
More the Bible, the better.
And being a Catholic, you go to church, I would go to church, and the only place I ever heard Bible ever was in church. So it was kind of interesting to hear all these stories, in the 70s that I'd never heard before.
So what other questions do we have about scripture or theology or liturgy or the church? Things you wrestle with. Eric, what do you got?
Yeah, it's a question or observation. A lot of, I should know, some of what's in the Bible is really opaque or puzzling, and it could be broad things like a whole parable, maybe kind of what the hell's going on here, or you look at a particular sentence and it doesn't seem to make any sense. And I would assume that it made more sense to the people then. And there's a couple explanations for this, and I don't know which, it's probably all 3. One is there could be transcription errors. And I just looked, in the earliest manuscript of the Bible dates from about 300 AD, something like that. So a lot could have gone on in that 300 years, just things got muddled up. The words could mean something different then than they mean now. And then there could be a different cultural context. And I just want to say that I think you've done a lot to try to put things into a cultural context to help clear up some of that a little bit. The other thing that makes me wonder about this is there is a passage we covered in the last year where Jesus takes the disciples aside and says, you know what, that didn't make much sense to these people out there. I'll explain it to you now. So it may be, in fact, that a lot of this stuff was puzzling and opaque to many of the people then, just as it is to us now.
So it's super interesting. So let's take a look at that Jesus story, Eric. So thank you for that. And I think you're right. And one thing I would encourage you to do when you get into one of those opaque, odd things where you're asking yourself, do we have a problem? We have a problem here. What is the problem? Is it translation? Is it cultural idiosyncrasies? What is it? When you wander into that, stop for a second. Just take that passage, whatever that passage is, and read it again, take notes, ask yourself questions, like play with it, right? Because even though it may be out of the cultural context of our time, something may crawl up out of that to you. It could be a word, it could be a sentence, it could be a question. So God speaks to us like that. So even in the areas like when you're like, what? There may be something that God's saying to Jesus and his disciples. Where is that in the Bible? Where Jesus is with his disciples and he pulls them apart from the other guys. Is that, Alvin, help me, is that John 8? Well, anyway, so he pulls them apart, but here's the question. So we say, okay, why is Jesus doing that? Is Jesus about secrets? No, Jesus isn't about secrets, right? That's the whole Athanasius Arian argument, like the Gnostics versus the non-Gnostics. So Jesus isn't about secrets. Right. So we know that's not why he's doing it. So the question is, why is he pulling them? Why is he pulling them together? Why is he doing that? Well, one thing we know is that the rabbis of the time weren't big pontificators. right? We have this idea, some of you been to the Holy Land with me, right? Who's been there with me? Yeah. So you know when we do that goofy thing, when you come down the mountain and you go into the cave and Jesus comes out and he talks and you got the highway and you're right there and Jesus never did that, right? It's fun for tourists, but Jesus taught in little groups, right? He always taught in groups, and he taught by asking them questions and by wrestling through the issues. So Eric, he takes the guys aside, he pulls them together. It's not about lecturing. Anybody who's done a lot of lecturing, like you, Eric, knows it's not necessarily the best way to facilitate learning. I mean, it works from the pulpit all the time, but right, it happens in these conversations where people are wrestling in communion. Mary said it when she was talking about studying together, studying the Bible together. Three things happen when we gather in little communities to have conversations. Number one, and they're the things that we seek to do at church, right? We invite God into our heart. We make a decision that we are going to go there and that we are going to be part of this conversation. So the first formative place is this place, the heart of the matter, right? The second is the relationship with your neighbor. And the third place, like Mary indicated, is you're thinking about us in relationship to a bigger community, the Episcopal Church at large, is what she said. And so I think what Jesus is doing is he's modeling. Jesus is always modeling for us something. And I think in this case, he's talking to us about how we teach and how we are formed. Now, liturgy in the church and the sermons that are given, that's a different spiritual experience than these small sort of groups that Jesus is, that Jesus created around himself. And then what did they do? Right? And that's how the church grew. Thanks, Eric. Thoughts? Other questions?
When you were saying that, I was thinking about the feeding of 5,000
Exactly.
and the contextual ideology of having people sit down in groups of 50 and 100
Mhm.
came from King David and from wartime and all of this. So there's that other kind of interesting layer that it's contextual, but it also draws upon this historical, very well-known tradition to people in this community.
Now, but let's want to look at that for a sec, right?
Yeah.
So you were there,
Yes.
right? And you get that big field, right? And if you look, so you stand in there and you're looking at the Sea of Galilee, and you look sort of what is that? What degrees is that?
90.
Anyway, the point is you look sort of this direction, your legs here and you look this direction, and the city that's straight over there is what? Tiberias. And Tiberias is the city, still there, where Herod Antipas lived, right? And so Herod's way over there, right? And he's looking over here, and certainly he's got spies that he sent over. And he's not close enough that you really see, but he's close enough on a clear day that he can probably see. And if you take that crowd that's all mingled together, right? So what does Herod see if it's all mingled together? He sees a bunch of people. But what does he see if you divide them into these groups?
War effort.
Oh, baby, right? He can count that off in a hot minute, right? And then he knows there's a new kingdom, right? There's a new king. Something is afoot here. So, yeah, it's the tradition of Moses and the tradition of David, but it's also Jesus. He doesn't need to do that. Why does Jesus do that? He doesn't need to do that. He doesn't, because there's a new king in town, and he's got an army. It's cool stuff. It's cool stuff. Thoughts or other questions or reflections on the Bible, on Jesus? Nothing? Alvin, Bill, you've read the Bible before? Wait, hold on. Bill's.
I have a curious question. Lazarus was raised in his hometown. And the man who appeared in a white robe, who was grabbed by the soldiers in Gethsemane and took off, leaving the white robe. I believe I recall you've suggested that was Lazarus. That would have been several days later. I've tried to find some timing between the resurrection of Lazarus and that event in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he would have spent several days in the robe and showed up there. In spite of the fact that no man wants to appear in public naked, He ran off and hopefully found something to put on. Why was he still wearing the robe days after the resurrection?
That is a super good question. So why do you think he was
I
wearing?
thought it
the
was
robe?
a dumb question, but go ahead.
That's a fabulous question. I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
So what happens, right? Lazarus raised from the dead, right? And then after he's raised from the dead, they have a party, right? Remember the party? And all of a sudden he gets to sit at the table, right? And that's when Mary does the whole thing with the embalming thing in chapter 12, the Gospel of John, right? And so I don't know the answer to that, but it could be as his just continued, like an outward invisible sign of his resurrection, right? That this is it, right? This is the symbol. I'm not taking this sucker off because I was dead with this and I'm at Jesus, and I'm alive with this and I'm with Jesus, and this thing's staying up. Now, maybe Martha washed it. I'm hoping so. Maybe the soldiers ripped it off because it really stunk. But I could see him. So, Diane, isn't the alb the same kind of undergarment that they wore, right? Like it's
Yeah.
so the alb that we wear is when we serve the altar is that robe, Bill, right? It's that undergarment, right, that one would wear, and then you would throw your cassock over it to do your regular work, and then you would put your surplice on when you shoot in for prayers, and then you flip your surplice off, right? So it's that undergarment. Now there's a lot of but that's what that is. Or if you were an ancient Roman, you wore that undergarment, and then you put your chasuble. If you're a wealthy dude, you put the chasuble on over that. So.
Isn't it, it's kind of a worker's garment, really? I
Which
mean,
one?
The
Alb?
the alb.
No, the alb's not.
No, the cassock
The
is.
cassock is. Yeah, the alb. That's interesting.
I would theorize that the vanity was gone. I mean, if you've been raised from the dead, I mean, he's a new man, and he's looking at life from a completely different perspective than one that we could even imagine. And so, I mean, who's got time to bathe when you're in the presence of God? Like, I mean, he's just in a different space about all of those things, I'm sure.
Alvin, I love what you're saying, but I'm thinking that we also know that the priests immediately began plotting on how to get rid of him, because he was living proof, no pun intended, of the miraculous abilities of our Mashiach, the Messiah. So it would seem that unless he's saying, I have been resurrected, I've been to the other side, I have come back, I am not afraid of dying again, why would he continue to wear the robe?
I'm sure it was that. I'm also sure of something, you see something in these scriptures where people have these encounters with Jesus, and they look different. They appear before the people, and people are like, isn't that the guy who was down at the corner who was blind and begging earlier? I'm not quite sure, right? There's this renewal, there's this new life that's come about for them. So, he's walking head up high, he's strutting, he's a new and different man. And so, I'm pretty sure with that also, there was no fear. I mean, why would you especially if Jesus is right there with you, there's no fear at all.
Thank you. Good questions. Thanks, guys. Other thoughts, other questions? Sheldon.
I have a question about the trident.
Okay.
Monday, Thursday, we have communion. And, of course, Easter Sunday. Why do we have communion on, I think it's Good Friday, Saturday, after Jesus just got crucified?
Good question. So I'll start with Saturday first. So Saturday is the Easter service, and we don't have communion until after he's been raised from the dead. right? That's when we turn on the lights, the like, if it goes up the candles, we start ringing your bells. Good Friday, we serve only the bread, not the wine, right? That, and then we also don't do the Eucharistic prayer on Good Friday. We serve out of the reserve sacrament, right? And the reserve sacrament we have taken on Monday, Thursday. I think you took it in this year, right, Kelly? So we've taken it into the Garden of Repose, right? And so it's been sanctified, and then it's taken to the Garden of Repose, and it's left there. In our case, the Garden of Repose is where, Sally? The chapel that you guys make beautiful, right?
I'm reading here.
Oh, yeah.
I'm reading my Bible.
Good. Finally, God, Lord. Some productive use of time in Bible study.
I'm behind in my studies.
Oh, yeah, right. Anyway, Sally and her team decorates the Garden of Repose, and it's pretty nice. So then we, and correct me or help me fill this out, Diane. And then, so that is already, we don't redo it, but we remember, right, the sanctification of Jesus Christ without going through the process of the Eucharist, right? So, I don't know, Diane, anything else you'd say
Yeah,
about
I
that?
don't know. We removed the reserve sacrament at noon on Good Friday. But that's a good question on why we actually share the reserve sacrament on Good Friday. Good question.
It just seemed like, it seems like a little celebratory.
Where you should fast through
It's
it,
more of a
right?
remembrance, I see.
Yeah, it's a good question, because we don't do the Eucharist, right?
Right.
So, and the Eucharist means Thanksgiving, right? And so we're not giving thanks on that day. So it's a good question. Other questions? I love that question. And back to you.
Probably, so much of this has to do with knowing a little bit about historical things that were going on at the time, because you'll make a lot of reference that, this was like talking about the battle, they had little things in little groups. And so what is a good thing to read kind of in concert with this, so you sort of know more about the historical things, so some of these things make sense, because sometimes you think, well, oh, I did not know that, and then you realize it's really important, but I don't know enough about Roman warfare or some of that stuff to say, oh, I can see that this would go back in this history, or you've done references saying, okay, in the Old Testament, if you were Jewish, you would have known this. And I know it because you've said that, but I wouldn't know it by just, at least I don't think I would know it by just reading it. I don't know enough about. So what's a good?
So I would say a couple of things. For us as a community, I would say go to the Holy Land, right? Because the Holy Land is the fifth gospel.
That didn't work.
I don't know, Ed Beck. I remember you before then. So do them, right?
That does help.
Right, because like you're in that space, it's the fifth gospel.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say, and this is tricky. Maybe we could do a better job with this incidentally. The second thing is read Pixner's books. You know I love Pixner. Pixner is, I think, wherever Pixner is. Pixner's stuff is really the best, and it's pretty simple and it's excellent because it puts you in the land. So I think Pixner is very good. Pixner. Bernard, Birdhard or something, Birdman or Birds. And he's a guy who should be republished in some publishing house. Pixner is, because they don't publish him anymore. And
We have a copy somewhere.
we have copies floating around. It's like you have to buy it. There's some right down in front of Shelley, right in front of you, Shelley.
All this?
Yeah, no, down below. Because here's the other thing, and this is a caution, and I don't know what this, some of these authors like Karen Armstrong and stuff aren't helpful.
Yeah.
They're not helpful. In fact, they get you totally confused. So there are a lot of people that write about the Bible who actually make it worse.
Why is that?
Because they write dumb stuff. right? Because they,
That's a matter of
She
opinion.
has an axe to grind.
sure it
Matter of opinion.
is, sure it is a matter of opinion, but oftentimes they do have it, I mean, they do have an like, they're making a point. Oftentimes they're secular authors, like the guy from the University of Iowa who wrote about Paul and James, right? We want to be reading people of faith who are writing about the Bible. We don't want to be reading people who are selling popular books. What's that guy's name? That guy who wrote about Muslims, and then he wrote that one about Paul and James.
But I guess my ears picked up when you said Karen Armstrong, because I've always thought it was pretty
Helpful?
authoritarian, helpful.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, so maybe that's the wrong, but there's just some folks. N.T. Wright is super good.
He's very good.
Right, N.T. Wright, like, and he's written, and he also goes by Tom Wright. And he is a super good authoritative, faithful writer. And he's written gobs, and you can watch him online if you want a really great teacher. I would go on, watch. He has a school. I think he's got Tom Wright School. Now, is that right? Do you watch him, Bill? He's very, very good. And I'm trying to think of who else is out there. But even people like Rob Bell put a lot of color, like a lot of contextual color into their books. And so I guess so the first question you ask before you read a book is like, and maybe Karen Armstrong's perfectly in there, but do a little research. Who are they? Why are they writing the book? What's their point for writing the book? And if you stumble upon N.T. Wright, you'll know, right, that he is a theologian, a bishop of a man of faith. So you say, okay, I'm a person of faith. I need some more context. I'm going to follow this person of faith, as opposed to going into the bookstore and looking in the religion section and seeing a book, and maybe then you get on your phone and you look it up. But the point is spend a little bit of time assessing the author. That's just what I would say, because there's so many that, Barbara.
So in defense of Karen Armstrong, she does. I mean, you had was a little bit of red meat there, Dwight. She does say up front in several of her books, and it's really interesting to read them in progression because she is a seeker. And she's someone like Evelyn Underhill, right, who many years prior chronicled her own search through mysticism, right? So she's fascinating to read in that respect. And she does say up front that, her purpose is to find the underlying truths across, this is where she culminates, to find the underlying truths across the major world religions. And we do say at Epiphany that Christianity is not the only path, right? So where she ends up is with compassion, right? She was someone who was sort of looking for a unified theory of everything. So she's also a bit of a skeptic, and she comes from a very intense religious background. I mean, someone who took the veil and, grew up in that and had a series of really extraordinary and not entirely pleasant experiences. So she brings a really interesting, I think, perspective of a seeker. Her approach to the Bible, in my experience of it, is disappointing in that she has some of the affect or approach of a Bart Ehrman, or that it's a kind of gotcha thing, as if reading the Bible as a narrative and looking for the flaws, rather than coming to it as a collection of wisdom, of poetry, of essay, of short story, and finding the through lines and an understanding of the philosophy of the Bible that emerges, which is really quite extraordinary, particularly in the Christian context. So I wouldn't just dismiss her, but can I also ask you a final question? Because I'm really interested in the sabbatical coming up. It feels to me that in the spirit of synthesis, it would be really interesting to hear you just say a couple of words about what you're thinking. You've laid down this foundation for us of understanding the philosophy of Christianity, that it does hang together as a philosophy. You've taken us through several years of study and application and experience of the Christian practices. And now you've said that you're turning yourself and seeking to turn us more toward bringing that knowledge and the experience of transformation into the world, not necessarily, charging forward and proselytizing, but bringing changed selves or selves that are in the process of change into situations we might have been afraid to encounter or engage in. And I wonder if I'm understanding you correctly, and if you could say a bit more about the synthesis of those kinds of things and what you're going to be thinking about and working on.
I'd love to. So, but I do want to thank you also before I do for the Karen Armstrong thing, because your point is exactly right. If you want to see somebody else's spiritual journey, that's fine. But if you're on your own, go to somebody who wants to teach you. Like go to a teacher, right? As opposed. So, and there's a ton of great teachers out there. So that is a great distinction, right? Karen Armstrong, super interesting journey, looking for a particular thing. But I would say, for us, and I understand, I don't know if I truly understand, there's a lot of synthesis and things, connection, overlap. One of the things that sometimes we don't do as super well-educated Episcopalians is just look at Christianity. I mean, I think the best thing we can do for any interfaith conversation that we'll ever be in is know a lot about this thing, right? And the more education we have on our own faith, the easier it is to interlock. On sabbatical, Barbara, I think that we so I'm looking forward to a couple of things on the sabbatical. One is thinking more about our big rocks, and what we call the Epiphany aphorisms, and how we have these sort of blocks of thinking that are both pithy and also okay, and an editor at my left hand, one on the right, one on the left, and then the deep theology of those, right? But secondly, I think that we are in a world, I don't need to tell anybody here, is increasingly divided and split and segregated. I believe that Christianity and the Christian identity has something to give the world that is healing. I believe this age of the Holy Spirit that I talk about a lot here is a new thing that's happening. So I see churches failing and falling and fumbling all over the place, and we stumble around a lot ourselves here, right? But we really need to sort of get into this flow where we go out into the community and say, this Christian thing is something that is of deep value in a world where identity is lost, in a world where we're going to be living, I think, in short order, where what we do and how we work is fundamentally different than it looked 25 years ago. And who we work for is going to look fundamentally different. And so who are we and how are we in the world? And what does Christianity say about that? And I do think we're jumping up on our white stallions, Barbara, charging out there, baby. We're going to go out there. And I do think we have something to invite people into. And I think the more we know about our faith, and the more secure we are with the product, if you will, the manner by which we worship and what it means to worship, then we are inviting and gathering. And I think as some churches slip, or some churches are still online, for God's sakes, we need to be the kind of church that is really out there and reaching out. So for me, the energy I get around this sabbatical and thinking about our aphorisms and thinking about our theology and the Epiphany way and being a learning church and all those things you guys hear all the time. How do we then take it out? Right. So first round, we built the church a bit. Second round, we built the buildings a bit. Not this one. We'll do that soon. But the third round is how we bring them in. Right. So I don't know. That's what I'm thinking about. And I think it's really, really important, particularly in a super secular city, to help people plant themselves in a world of faith.
I think just from my own experience, what compelled me most about Epiphany, coming back to the church as an adult, was the experience of equanimity, knowing it's possible, right? Was the experience of the people who are at the church and seeing it in them, as opposed to, or in comparison to, an experience I had of many other Christian churches, where I was being told I must believe a thing before I was welcome. And so taking and you've said this so many times, that if we do the work on ourselves and our personal relationships, and we bring that affect into a tough conversation at work, or in community, that in and of itself is the beginning, maybe, of a turn. And rather than coming in with a Bible and saying, okay, you must recite these words from John, or you're going to hell.
Hey, we
right?
won't do that, Barbara.
Okay.
Your forum on Sunday was excellent about kind of finding some hope in all the chaos that's happening. And I kind of left saying, okay, we do have a role as Christian person to have that faith and to somehow take it out into the world, and that it's not hopeless.
Right.
And I thought that was really powerful.
We hold the hope, right? That's a Christian thing. We hold it.
I think it's important to witness sometimes, and I don't think that anybody in this room was probably brought up to do that. It's considered evangelizing or Bible thumping or something else, but I think it's important to witness. You don't have to quote the Bible to do it, because we couldn't anyway, most of us, chapter and verse. But I think it's important to witness when people are, in fact, it's probably ethically, it's probably our responsibility.
Certainly to invite. Well, okay, an announcement of it. We'll go. Brother?
I grew up evangelical, and the saying was, as always, preach Christ all the time and sometimes use words. And so,
Yeah.
Alvin, do you have an announcement?
I would, in love and acceptance of Barbara, I would raise a question. Yes, wherever you are in your spiritual walk, you have a place at Epiphany. I think that's beautiful. It's a welcoming statement. We are Epiphany. The Epiphany in Christianity was the manifestation of Christ. Christ himself said, I am the only way. No man cometh unto the Father except through me. So as we are all coming together from our various walks throughout our lives, many of us came back to the church in later life, Barbara, we did too. We are here because of Christ, and the manifestation of Christ at Epiphany is evangelism, really. It is simply sharing the beautiful truth of our Messiah, and he is the only way to heaven.
I would just say that I'm talking about initial encounters and a way of practicing Christianity. I mean, for me personally, I have chosen this path. This is the path that hangs together most for me. I remember one of my Buddhist teachers saying to me, if you're going to go back to Christianity, then stick with it. Don't be jumping around, between Christianity and Buddhism and, whatever else, whenever the road gets rough, because you pick one, you stay with it, because the system of belief has the way through for you. It's baked in. And this is the one that feels to me most right. And I'm happy to talk to people about that. But all I'm saying is, I think that what Doit hit on, and he's talked about several times, is really profound. And I've not seen in a lot of other Christian contexts, which is do your own work.
Yeah.
And then put yourself out there and in relationship. And that begins the process of transformation of community.
We
Well, I
are
would
way
say,
over time. If we could end the conversation with Alvin repeating that wonderful, sweet statement he made. That really sums up, and I think Barbara and I would agree on the beauty and the truth of that.
yeah, Alvin, how about you repeat that and then tell us what your announcement is and then we'll have a prayer.
Preach Christ always, and sometimes use words.
That's very Franciscan, Alvin.
Do you have an announcement for us, Alvin?
I do. So this summer, this class for many of us is a part of our spiritual journey, and I would like that journey to continue and not just take a hiatus this summer. So I would love to welcome all of you to join me in a summer study of the book of Genesis, starting the Friday after this next, the 17th. Same bat time, same bat channel, online and in person. And 10:30 on Fridays, I will see you there. We will start from the beginning. The only mention of baseball in the Bible, in the beginning.
That'd be fun.
No, I won't. I may tune in and I'll take my video off because I'll be in Europe and so it'll be late so I can have a glass of wine and listen to you Bible. All right, let's pray. Let's thank God. God, it is so good to be together, to study the Bible, to ask our questions, just to be in love with you, Lord, and to follow you faithfully and let that love spill out in all sorts of ways, right? By following you and using words when we need to, the great insight that Alvin gives us, we learn from the Franciscans and others along the way, as how to be in the world, to change the world, to bring the world back into that steady state, that equanimity, that peace of heart that ties us with soul and eternity. Bless each one of us as we step out into the world and we move with grace and peace and beauty and love. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
It's super.